Hi Year 11s. I'm just going to go over how to answer some of the basic coding questions. So I'm going to be focusing in on variables, input, print, and if statements and things like that, rather than focusing in on the more complicated loops and arrays functions, which I'll do in a separate homework. Okay. So there's three skills you need to develop when dealing with basic code questions. The first one is know your keywords. Now, keywords are best revised using flashcards. It's just probably the best way. Code patterns, you need to know how the code is structured. One of the biggest mistakes that I see from GCSE students and sixth form, if I'm honest with you, is people forget how to structure certain commands. So for example, how to write an input statement or how to write an if statement correctly. And because of that, you write it down incorrectly, even though you've correctly identified when you need it, and so on and so forth. So we're going to look at that as well. And also how do you read the exam questions and how do you identify what you need? Okay, because that is obviously the more complex skill, but actually I hopefully will show you a nice easy way to think about it, and hopefully that will help you. Okay. So some keywords, a variable, and you should know this inside and out by now, but it's where I can store a single value. Okay, now obviously if I have an array, I can store multiple values, but we are just at the moment talking about a single value. That could be an integer, it could be a string, doesn't matter, but I need a name for it, okay, or an identifier, and that name or identifier will basically allow me to use it later on in my program. So it's a stored location in memory in RAM where I can store a single value, and then I can change that value as the program goes along. Now, when I want to give a value to a variable, I need to use assignment. That is the equal sign. So I might have something like x equals 5. So the equals in that scenario means assignment. It will take whatever's on the right hand side and store it in the left. Then we got some of the branching or flow statements. So flow is a bit like how a river will flow from one place to another. So it's the order that we run the instructions in. Sometimes it's known as sequencing, okay, the sequence of instructions. Normally it runs from start to finish. However, I might change the sequence if I've got one of these three commands. Selection, if statements, because it will have a condition, and if that condition is true, it will run one thing, and then if it's false, it might run something completely different. Okay, so depending on a condition, whether I know a equals 5 or a is greater than 5 or something along those lines, that will be the choice it makes. Iterations when we loop, okay, so that's going to be our while loops. And obviously that's going to jump back to an earlier part of the program. So we'll get to the bottom of the while loop, jump back to the start of the while loop, and then go again however many times we need to do that. And then a function, which I know is something that some of you find tricky, but essentially when I have a function, I will jump to where that function starts, run through the function and return to wherever it was called from. I will spend an entire homework just on functions in the future to help you practice that skill, and hopefully when we do practice that skill you won't find it as tricky, because there's some tricks that I will teach you to make those questions much easier to understand and hopefully do for you. Okay. Data types. This is something people forget to revise. Please don't, because OCR likes asking questions about data types, and they're dead simple. Casting is when I change from one data type to another. So that's where maybe I'll have my input command, and I want that input to be a number, an integer. So I use the int command next to it to be something like int inputs. So I use the int to turn it into an integer, I use my str to turn it into a string, and float to turn it into a floating point or real number. Strings are text, okay, so like it's a string of characters. Remember, text can be spaces or full stops or commas or even digits, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as long as it's in quotes. Okay, and you have to do that when you talk about strings as well, because it's important. You do that. Data type is a type of data, so every variable will have a data type, and that will be, I don't know, string, integer, real, Boolean, you get the idea. Integers, whole numbers, you know that from maths. Floating point or real numbers, they mean the same thing, and essentially that's when it's a decimal number. And then Boolean will be true or false. Now, the next thing is code patterns. Okay, guys. Do put these into your notes, okay? You need to know the structure of how these things work. So on the screen, I have got these code patterns. What I will do is in this homework, I will attach these code patterns as well for you to use for your revision. Please do read over these, make sure you know how to write them. These are stuff we've done time and time again. I'm going to be focusing in on input and selection and updating and storing values mainly in this homework. So how do you use these code patterns? Because I keep talking about them, but how on earth do you use them? Well, when you have a problem, so here I've got maybe like a 6-marker hard program question. We're looking for marks, okay? Do not worry about being the world's best coder. You don't need to be. What you need to do is just identify when you might need some programming, because one of the mistakes I see when you guys do exam papers is you see a hard question, you go, nah, not for me, mate. But you can pick up marks, okay? Let's pick up some marks, and the more you practice, the more confident you'll get, and the more you'll be able to access the later marks as well. Okay, so how can we get some marks? Well, first of all, it says allows voters to enter either A, B, or C. Now, the word enter is my trigger word. Okay, in that sentence, I want to enter a value into the computer. Well, what's another way of saying enter? Well, I could ask for that information, or I could input. So what I'm trying to do is work out which code pattern does that most likely sound like, okay? Because once I know that, I'll get something like this, okay? A equals input. Well, I can just change it, can't I? Well, instead of going A equals input, enter a value, enter the number of enter a vote, okay? Is it A, B, or C? Okay, I might have vote equals input, who you voting for, okay? So what's my question? What's my prompt for the person? And what identifier will I use to store that value? Okay. Then the next one says keep track of how many times each candidate has been voted for. Sounds complicated, isn't it? But how do I keep track of something? Well, if I was doing it as a human, I'd probably write it down, wouldn't I? Okay, I would store it on paper. What's another word for store? Well, variable, isn't it? It allows me to store a single value. That's a definition, textbook definition of a variable. So variables allow me to store. So in this scenario, I need to keep track of how many times candidate A, B, and C have been voted for. Well, I need 3 variables, 1 to store how many times I vote for A, 1 for B, 1 for C. Okay, so I just create variables. Okay, that's all I do. And this is how you go through these questions. Okay, look at it very carefully. Go, well, okay, each of these bullet points, what's the best command I can use for each of them? Okay, if you think about that, then you won't go too far wrong. Okay, one of the key kind of basic what you have to be able to do is a counter-controlled loop. So when we have a counter-controlled loop, this is where we'll have a starting position. Okay, so for example, here I'm starting at the number 1. We'll have an end condition, and that's basically it will loop until this is no longer true. So in this case, while A is less than 10, then I loop. If A is equal to 10 or bigger than 10, I stop looping. And then we have a way of getting from the start to the end. What this will do is it will generate a number pattern. Okay, so in this case, the number pattern is 1, then it's going to be 2, all the way until A is 10. And as soon as A is 10, it will stop looping. So the keywords for this one is things like this, so not exhaustive list obviously, but if I'm repeating something, do something again until those kind of words will have to maybe do something more than once. Okay, that's when I know I might need a loop. And the key here is if I want to use a counter-controlled loop, then I need to do something a set number of times. If I'm reading a question, it says, okay, you need 5 people to join a ride for a roller coaster, or I don't know, you need 5 stamps for your stamp collection. Okay, I'm making stuff up, obviously, but it's when there's a clear number in mind, and it says, well, we need to do something that number of times, or we need this number of things to happen. That's when I know I need a counter-controlled loop. Okay, so that hopefully will help you identify. And again, for homework, we'll spend an entire homework just focusing in on that type of loop. All right. Anyways, also we can go backwards with a counter-control loop, and when we have our if statements, we could also have elif. That's if I need to ask another kind of check another condition. So is it this or this or this or this? Oh, it must be this then. Okay, so that's the kind of is it this or is it this kind of question or scenario. Else is the false part of the statement. So if none of those things are true, well, the else is the last thing. So think of that along the lines of if all else fails, I do this. Okay, or else. So now, I'm not going to go over all of this today because there's quite a lot in this video. What I'm going to do is just kind of like show you an exam question and show you that it's not as scary as it looks for the most part. So here it's got a scenario. Okay, so like electronic voting booth. I know I've shown this question before. Then we have a bullet point list. Now, what they do is they've decomposed the problem. I mean, decomposition is when I break down a problem into smaller parts to make it easier to solve. Okay, think of this as, all right, this is how I get my marks. Okay, I'll do this bullet point, this one, and then this one. Okay, now it isn't necessarily that simple. However, from a marks perspective, okay, do you need to do all of it to get 1 mark? No, you need to do one of those bullet points to get a mark. Okay, so what I really want you to focus in on is find the bits you can do. Okay, if you struggle massively with functions, okay, fine. Okay, not a worry. Well, focusing on stuff you can do. Can you do inputs? Okay, you should be able to because we've been doing it since year 8. Okay, so at this stage, if you can't do input, please revise that really carefully because it's bread and butter kind of stuff. How do you store a single value? Bread and butter again. So I've already mentioned you allow voters to enter. Well, that's going to be an input command. Okay. Well, right, inputs. I've started. I kind of thinking then, should I bother writing it all out? And I'm probably not going to do it for the rest of it. Never mind. Keep track. Okay. Store value. Okay. One value, that's a variable. Okay. As soon as one person finishes voting, allows the next person to vote. Well, I'm repeating something there. Loop. Okay. Now it doesn't say repeat or until and things like that in that statement, but it does clearly suggest I'm repeating something. And as soon as I think I'm repeating something, that's a loop. So this part of it we'll look at another part lesson, but sort of a homework. But this one we're going to focus in on. So when we do our questions, we will decide what variables we need to use. Okay, what do I need to store? Okay, and we saw that bullet point was quite clear on what we need to do. Okay, each of those bullet points match to a code pattern, which I've just been mentioning. Okay, then I get my variables down, and then I can do my coding part. Okay, so let's see how this works. So I need my variables, and I've already mentioned that is this bit. Also, do I have any inputs? Well, if I do, then I need a variable to store the input as well. So I need 4 variables in this one. I need something to keep track of the count of A, of B, and C. Okay, so how many times has somebody voted for A? How many times somebody voted for B? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then also I've got this vote here, which I'm using to store the inputs. Okay, so then I'm matching all these things. So I've got my variables here, boop. I've got my inputs here. And then also keep track of how many times to vote for. Well, I also need a way of saying, okay, well, if I enter A, I'm going to update the variable to say that. Okay, so if I vote for A is going to be one's going to add to A. If I vote for B is going to add 1. Okay, so I've got a decision to make as well. Okay, it doesn't say if in this statement, but keep track of how many times each candidate's been voted for. We think about it. If I vote for A, I need to update A. Can imagine this on paper. If I said A's been voted for, you might create a tally, wouldn't you? You know, very likely. You know, I say, well, it's B this time, then A, then B, then C again. You know, you probably do a tally for it. So you make a decision. Okay, if someone says A, then I'm going to make a tally on A. In programming, if they enter the letter A in the input, well, then I'm going to add 1 to A count. Okay, if they enter B, I'm going to add 1 to B count. Okay, so here's the code in its finality for this video. So you notice I've got my variables at the top. Okay, I've got my input here. So straight away, all you could do is the inputs. Well, that's one mark, isn't it? Boom, let's do that. Then keep track how many times each time it's been voted for. I've got that in this if statement here. And notice also that I've got this A count equals A count plus 1. So I'm adding 1 to A counts. Okay, so whenever you see something like this where you have X equals X plus 1, well, that is when I'm updating a variable. So in this case, I'm taking the value of X, adding 1 to it, and then assigning it back to the variable X here. Okay, so that's how you update a value inside a variable or update it.